At the altar, my fiancé never came. His mother tore off my veil and poured wine over my gown. "You were just a placeholder," she laughed. As I collapsed, a voice behind me said, "Don't break." His billionaire boss stepped forward. "Marry me instead." The organ stopped at 2:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on the back wall for the last 7 minutes, doing the only thing a nurse knows how to do when everything is spiraling. I was counting, measuring, trying to diagnose the situation before the patient flatlined. My bouquet was white roses, 24 of them, because Ryan had said 24 was our number. The date we met, June 24th, the apartment number where I'd lived when I first kissed him, the number of hours in a day, and every single one of them I want to spend with you, Maya. I'd rolled my eyes at that. I'd kept the roses anyway. The thorns were cutting into my palms. I hadn't let go. 400 people were staring at me. The stained glass was throwing fragments of colored light across the marble floor, and I remember thinking it looked almost beautiful, how a church could turn even catastrophe into something luminous. The bridesmaids behind me had gone so still I could no longer hear them breathing. My maid of honor, Danielle, Dr. Danielle Reyes, trauma surgeon, certified unflappable under pressure, had reached forward once and touched my shoulder. I'd shrugged her off without turning around, because I was watching the front pew. She was sitting with her legs crossed, a glass of red wine balanced between two fingers like she was at a gallery opening. Margaret Vance, Ryan's mother. She was wearing silver, not champagne, not ivory, not a tasteful dove gray. Silver, sequined with a neckline that plunged and a slit that climbed, a gown that cost more than my dress, and said, quietly but unmistakably, "This is my event. You are the prop." She hadn't called Ryan. That's what told me everything. When your son is 45 minutes late to his own wedding, you call him, you pace. You grab the efficient by the elbow. You send his best man sprinting to the parking lot. You do something that resembles concern. Margaret Vance sat in her pew and sipped her wine and smiled at people she recognized and did not once reach for her phone. She already knew. I need to back up. I need to explain how a 31-year-old ICU nurse with a graduate degree and, I'd always believed, functional pattern recognition ended up standing at an altar in a bloodied wedding dress in front of 400 witnesses while a woman she'd tried to love for 3 years systematically dismantled her life in real time. The short answer is, love makes you see what you want to see. The longer answer starts 18 months before the wedding, on the night Ryan Vance walked into the ER at St. Augustine Medical Center with a laceration on his forearm that turned out to be superficial, and an ego that turned out to be structural. He was beautiful. That's the part I'm least proud of admitting. Dark hair, jaw like a film still, the kind of hands that look like they belong on a piano. He was a junior analyst at Titan Corporation at the time, which I registered as mildly impressive without knowing much about what Titan actually did. He said funny things while I stitched his arm. He asked for my number when I was done. I gave it to him. It was the most impulsive decision I had made in a decade, and for a long time, it felt like the best one. He was charming in a way that made you feel chosen. He remembered obscure details, a passing comment about my grandmother's cobbler, the name of a professor I'd hated in nursing school, and produced them weeks later like small trophies of attention. He sent flowers to my apartment when I had brutal shifts. He learned how to pronounce labetalol so he could ask intelligent questions about my day. He also, in retrospect, had a habit of flinching when his mother called. She called constantly, long calls, taken in the next room, voice dropping to a hush I could never quite parse. When I asked about them, he'd surface from wherever he'd been with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and say, "She just worries. You know how mothers are." I didn't, actually. My mother died when I was 11. My father raised me alone in a 2-bedroom in Cleveland until he passed my junior year of college, working doubles and leaving casseroles in the fridge with sticky notes that said, "Eat this or so help me, Maya." I didn't know how mothers were. I gave Ryan the benefit of every doubt I had. The first time I met Margaret Vance was at a dinner party she hosted at her townhouse on the Upper East Side, 14 months into Ryan's and my relationship. The table was set with china that cost more than my car. There were 2 other couples, both old money, fluent in the language of foundations and board memberships and summer houses in places I'd never been. Margaret seated me at the far end of the table, poured me a smaller glass of wine than everyone else, and spent the dinner addressing me exclusively in the form of questions. And what did you study? And where did you go to school? And is it true that nurses can earn quite comfortable salaries now? Each question was delivered with a smile that never changed, the smile of a woman who had already reached her verdict and was simply documenting her reasoning. I told Danielle about it afterward. She listened with her arms folded, her surgeon's face on, and then said, "Run." I laughed. I stayed. The proposal came 8 months later, on a rooftop with string lights and champagne, and Ryan on one knee with a ring I later learned Margaret had selected and paid for. I said yes. I cried. I called Danielle at midnight and cried some more. Looking back, I can track the escalation in 3-month intervals like a disease progression. 3 months before the wedding, Margaret Vance began inserting herself into every planning decision. She overrode my florist, replaced my cake designer with hers, and had a conversation with the venue coordinator that I was not invited to, and that resulted in the seating chart being restructured so that my colleagues and friends from St. Augustine were moved to the back of the room. When I confronted Ryan about it, he said, "She means well. She just has a lot of opinions." I pointed out that I also had opinions. He said, "Maya, please, I can't fight her on everything." I heard the word can't and told myself it was won't. I told myself they were different. 6 weeks before the wedding, Ryan started working late. Not unusual. He'd been climbing fast at Titan, and his his boss, Julian Thorne, was the kind of CEO who was profiled in magazines under headlines like "The Man Who Never Sleeps." I'd seen Thorne at one company event, a charity gala Ryan had taken me to the previous spring. He was tall, quietly dressed, with the kind of stillness that rooms reorganized themselves around. He'd been pointed out to me from across a ballroom, and I'd thought, that man looks like he has never been surprised in his life. Ryan's late nights didn't worry me. What worried me was that he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom. A small thing, a nothing thing, I told myself. 2 weeks before the wedding, I overheard a phone call. Ryan had forgotten I was home. I'd come back early from a night shift, silent in my scrubs, and I'd stood in the hallway outside the kitchen while he said, in a voice lower and more careful than the voice he used with me, "Mother, I told you. It's handled. She doesn't know anything. Yes, I know about Sterling. I know. I'll be careful." I stepped back into the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the wall for a long time. Sterling. I didn't know anyone named Sterling. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself it's handled meant something innocuous. A vendor issue, a scheduling conflict, a work matter. I told myself the careful voice was just Ryan managing his mother, the way he always did. I told myself a lot of things in those 2 weeks. I finished planning my wedding. I picked up my dress from the boutique. I had my final fitting with Danielle standing behind me in the mirror, saying, "God, Maya, you look incredible," and me smiling back at both of us like I believed it. Part 2, what happens when the room goes quiet. She stood up at 2:21 p.m. Margaret Vance rose from the front pew with the unhurried elegance of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment her entire life. Someone handed her a microphone. I still don't know who. I have turned this detail over 100 times and I cannot figure out when the microphone appeared, and she walked to the altar with her wine glass and her smile and her silver dress, and she faced 400 people like she was about to give a toast. I was 3 feet away from her. I didn't move. "There will be no wedding today," she said. The room inhaled as one. 400 people, one breath. My knees locked. My fingers tightened on the roses, and I felt a thorn push deeper into my right palm, a thin blade of pain that I held onto because it was real, because it was something I could measure. "My son is across town right now," she continued, and her voice was ringing, resonant, a voice trained for rooms like this, for moments like this. "He is with Isabella Sterling, a real heiress, a woman with money, with breeding, with a name that opens the right doors." She turned to me and the smile didn't waver. "You were never the destination, sweetheart. You were just keeping his bed warm while he climbed." Placeholder. She said it like a category, like a filing system. I have stood in emergency rooms and watched the moment someone realizes they are dying. I know what it looks like when a person's understanding of their own life shifts irrevocably on its axis. I know the face. I know the stillness. I know how the body tries to reject the information. I know, because I made that face. I went that still. My body tried. And this dress. She reached out and grabbed my veil, a cathedral-length piece of French lace that Danielle and I had spent 2 Saturdays looking for. She grabbed it at the comb, where it was pinned into my hair. "White? Really?" She ripped it from my head. The comb tore across my scalp. I felt it, a bright, clean line of pain, and then the warm crawl of blood at my hairline. My hair fell around my shoulders in knots, the careful updo dissolving, and I stood there with bleeding palms and a bleeding scalp, and I still did not move, because I was calculating. Even then, even in that moment, the nurse in me was running down the checklist. Don't fall, don't scream, don't give her what she wants. Breathe, count, assess. She raised the wine glass. She looked at me with those flat, careful eyes. "Let's fix the color," she said. The cold hit me first. Then the smell. Dark, fruity, almost sweet. The wine soaked through the silk in under 2 seconds, and I watched it happen from somewhere slightly outside my body. Watched the ivory go crimson in a spreading stain that looked, in the colored light from the stained glass, almost like something I'd seen in the ER. Almost like something I knew how to stop. I couldn't stop this. I went to my knees, not because I chose to, because my legs decided that the information was too much, that the body had hit its limit, that the marble floor was where we were going to be for a while. I felt the cold of the stone through the ruined dress, and I stared at the floor and I could hear people laughing, actual laughter, from somewhere in the back, bright and careless, and I remember thinking, this is the worst moment of my life and someone in this room is finding it funny. The wine was dripping off my chin. 400 people. One of them had gotten their phone out. I could see the small rectangle of light at the edge of my vision. "Go back to your bedpans, nurse," Margaret Vance said, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Not hurried, not running, deliberate, heel to toe, measured. The steps of someone who had decided exactly what they were doing and was not going to be rushed about it. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the room the way a clear tone cuts through static. Click, click, click. Every step landed like a verdict. The laughter died. I don't know if it was the footsteps or the temperature, but I felt the room change. I have worked trauma for 6 years. I know what it feels like when a space goes from chaos to order because someone with authority has entered it. I felt that shift before I saw him. Julian Thorne crouched down beside me on the wine-soaked marble. He was wearing a charcoal suit that I would later find out cost $11,000. He was kneeling in it without apparent concern. He was close enough that I could see his face clearly, angular, controlled, expression stripped of everything except focus, and he was looking at me the way I look at a patient who is about to give up, like he wasn't going to let that happen. "Look at me," he said. His voice was quiet. This was not a man who needed to project. "Don't fall apart, not when you're about to win." Part 3. What he knew, and when he knew it, he stood. He took my hand and pulled pulled me up, and I came up slowly. Unsteady on heels, I'd practiced walking in for 2 weeks, and I found my footing and I stood beside Julian Thorne, and I did not know what was happening, but I trusted that something was happening. The way you trust a surgeon entering an OR who doesn't explain every step. You just see the certainty, and you follow. He turned to face the room. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't need one. 3 years ago, Julian said, I was on I-95. Car fire. I was trapped, bleeding, and conscious long enough to watch several dozen vehicles slow down, take photographs, and drive on. Dead silence. The kind of silence that a church full of 400 people can produce is extraordinary. It has mass. It has weight. I felt it pressing on my eardrums. One person stopped, he continued. She broke a window with her bare hands. She pulled me out. She used her own clothing to apply pressure to the wounds on my chest and arm. And when the paramedics arrived, she was gone. A pause. I have been looking for her for 3 years. He turned and looked at me, and I felt the floor tilt, because I remembered I-95. I remembered June 2nd, 3 years ago, coming off a double shift at St. Augustine, driving home in my 2019 Honda Accord in my spare set of scrubs because I'd ruined the first pair. I remembered seeing the smoke and pulling over before I'd consciously made the decision to pull over, because that is what you do. That is what 6 years of emergency nursing rewires you to do. I remembered a man in a burning car and the 3 cars that passed while I was still on the phone with 911. I remembered hitting the window with my elbow twice before it gave. I remembered the weight of him, much heavier than I expected, and the way I'd torn the hem of my scrub top to pack the wound on his chest. I remembered leaving when the paramedics arrived, because I had to be back at St. Augustine in 4 hours, and I hadn't thought, I genuinely had not thought, that there was anything remarkable about it. I had told no one, not even Danielle. It was just a Wednesday. Margaret Vance had gone white. For the first time since this began, the smile was gone. As for Isabella Sterling, Julian continued, and his voice changed. It went cold the way a surgical suite goes cold, controlled and precise and entirely merciless. She is an actress. Her name is Cara Wells. She's represented by the Meridian Theatre Company in London, and I hired her 11 weeks ago. The microphone that Margaret was still holding hit the floor. The feedback screamed through the speakers, and then died. What? Margaret's voice came out stripped of its training, raw, small. My employee, Julian said, was engaged to the woman who saved my life. I discovered this 14 weeks ago, through a background check that was routine and turned out to be anything but. He let that land. I needed to know what kind of man Ryan Vance was, so I did what anyone in my position would do. I built a test. The almost smile was precise and cold as a scalpel. I introduced a fake heiress, a fake merger, a fabricated family fortune, and a social world that Ryan had always wanted to enter. I made it look very convincing. I gave him every opportunity to walk away from it. He looked at Ryan's empty seat. He sold out his fiancé in 22 hours. He told Cara, who he believed was Isabella Sterling, that his engagement was essentially a formality, that Maya Calloway was a nurse he'd been with for convenience, that once the merger was finalized, he planned to end things quietly. Julian paused. I have the recordings. My attorneys filed them this morning as part of a workplace conduct review. Ryan Vance's position at Titan Corporation was terminated at 9 a.m. today. The murmur that moved through the room was low and steady, like a tide coming in. Mrs. Vance, Julian's eyes found her. I believe you were aware of the arrangement with Miss Wells. I believe you coordinated with your son to ensure that Maya would be in this building, in this dress, available to be humiliated in front of as many witnesses as possible. My legal team will be in contact. Margaret Vance sat down. The doors at the back of the church burst open. Ryan Vance came down the aisle at a run, tie crooked, shirt untucked, one shoe slightly undone, breathing in the ragged way of a man who has sprinted multiple city blocks and cannot figure out why the world has rearranged itself in his absence. He pulled up short when he saw me, when he saw Julian beside me, when he read the room, and I watched him read it, watched his eyes move fast across the frozen guests and his white-faced mother and the wine-soaked marble and me, and I watched him begin to calculate. That's the part I want you to understand. That is the part I replay. He was not calculating what happened to Maya. He was calculating what this means for Ryan. Boss, he was still breathing hard. What is, Maya, what is going on? Why is, you're just in time, Julian said pleasantly. Take a seat in the back. You're a guest now. Ryan moved toward me. His hand went to my arm, and I let it rest there for a moment because I wanted to look at him. Really look. One final, clear-eyed appraisal. I saw the sweat at his temples, the panic in his eyes, the rapid calculations running behind his face. I looked for grief. I looked for guilt. I looked for a single moment in which his concern was for me, for what I was standing in, for the blood on my scalp, for the 400 people who had witnessed my demolition. I found nothing. Not one thought about me. Maya, listen to me. His voice had dropped to the intimate register he used when he wanted something. I love you. I made a terrible mistake. My mother, she's been pressuring me for months. I didn't know how to. I want to tell you there was a long, dramatic pause here. There wasn't. I let go of the roses. They hit the marble and the sound was very soft. I turned to Julian. He was watching me with that same focused stillness, not guiding me, not performing anything, just present, waiting. I grabbed his lapels and I kissed him. I want to be honest about this. It was not planned. It was not strategic. It was the action of a woman who had just had every careful, measured instinct she'd suppressed for 3 years burn away in a single afternoon, and what was left underneath was someone who was done being careful. It was impulse. It was fury. It was something I cannot fully explain and have never apologized for. He froze. For half a second, one breath, he went completely still. And then his arms came around me, and he held on with the steadiness of someone who was not going anywhere, and the church was utterly silent, and I heard Ryan make a sound behind me that was somewhere between my name and a question. When I pulled back, I turned to the officiant. He was a kind man, Father Gregory Chen, who had been officiating weddings at this church for 22 years. He was looking between me and Julian and me again, with an expression of profound ecclesiastical uncertainty. I do, I said. It was not technically legally binding. Father Chen would explain this to us very gently much later over tea in the vestry. There are forms, there is paperwork, there is a license. But he did what I think any reasonable man of faith does when a woman in a wine-soaked dress on a bloody marble floor looks at him with that kind of certainty. He said the words. Ryan's scream bounced off the vaulted ceiling. Two of Julian's security team, men I hadn't noticed, positioned near the back doors like architectural features, moved to the aisle with the quiet efficiency of people who had been briefed. Ryan was escorted out still yelling, and the sound of him diminished and then stopped, and the doors swung shut and the church was quiet again. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Part 4. After the bridal suite at the venue was very white. White walls, white chaise longue, white vanity with a ring of theatrical bulbs. I stood in front of the mirror and watched wine drip onto the floor from the hem of my dress, and I assessed the situation the way I would assess a patient. Scalp laceration, minor. Palms, superficial puncture wounds from thorns. Dress, total loss. Self, intact. I was shaking. My hands wouldn't stop. I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, the rhythm I teach to patients in pain. Danielle came in first. She said nothing, which is one of the things I love most about her. She just sat next to me on the chaise and put her hand over mine, and we sat like that for a while. Then she said, "So, Julian Thorne." "I know," I said. "I mean, Maya, I know." He kneeled on marble in an $11,000 suit. "Danielle, for you." There was a knock at the door. She opened it. Julian was outside holding a garment bag, composed and correct as if the last 2 hours had been a mildly eventful board meeting. "There's a reception," he said. 270 of the 400 guests are still in the building. The caterers are continuing. The band started about 10 minutes ago. He paused. "I didn't want to presume, but I thought you might want an alternative." He held out the garment bag. I unzipped it. Crimson red, floor-length silk charmeuse with a structured bodice and a back that draped low and clean. It had the particular weight and quality of something made for a specific body. My body, I realized, as I held it up. "This was made for me," I said. 12 weeks ago, he said, after I confirmed it was you. He paused. "I hoped you'd never need it. I hoped he would pass the test, but I wanted you to have something waiting, just in case." I looked at him for a long time. "Who are you?" I asked. Because I needed to hear it. Because standing in a destroyed dress in a white room, I needed something to be real. His eyes didn't move from mine. "The man who has been waiting 3 years to answer that question," he said. Epilogue. 14 months later. The legal proceedings against Margaret Vance were filed by Julian's attorneys on the Monday following the wedding. The charges involved coordinating a scheme to emotionally harm a private individual, and, this one surprised even me, civil fraud, related to contracts Margaret had signed with the venue and vendors under the pretense of a legitimate event. Dr. Patricia Hollis, a forensic psychologist retained by Julian's legal team, provided a formal assessment used in the civil case. Margaret's attorneys settled out of court for a figure that my own attorney, a sharp and unsmiling woman named Rachel Kim, who had 30 years in civil litigation and zero patience for nonsense, described as significant. Ryan Vance's termination from Titan Corporation stood. He attempted to file a wrongful dismissal suit. It was dismissed in February. I heard from a former colleague that he'd moved to his mother's Connecticut house after his Tribeca apartment lease ended. I did not think about this very much. The recording that Julian's investigators had made of Ryan's conversations with Isabella Sterling was entered into evidence in the civil proceedings as Exhibit C. I listened to it once in Rachel Kim's conference room, sitting beside Danielle, who held my hand throughout. Hearing Ryan's voice explaining, in casual and detailed terms, why I was convenient and what he planned to do once he'd secured the Sterling money, I don't have a clean word for what that felt like. It felt like confirmation of something I'd suspected for longer than I'd admitted, and it felt like being cut, and it felt like the peculiar relief of a wound that's been infected finally being properly cleaned. It hurt less than I expected. That surprised me. What I did not expect was the video. Someone at the wedding had recorded Margaret's moment at the altar. Of course they had. It was 400 people, and it was 2024, and we are the generation that documents everything. The video was 9 minutes long, and it began with the wine, and it ended with Julian pulling me to my feet, and it was posted to 3 different platforms before I'd changed out of the dress. By Monday morning, it had been viewed 11 million times. By Wednesday, it was being reported on by outlets I actually read. The comments said things I'm not going to repeat in detail, except to say that the consensus was clear. A woman who had worked emergency trauma for 6 years, who had spent her wedding morning doing a 6-hour shift because a colleague had called in sick, who had stood in a wine-soaked dress on a marble floor and not said a single word while being systematically demolished, that woman, the internet decided, had earned whatever came next. Julian and I married properly, legally, on a Tuesday in October in a courthouse in Lower Manhattan, with Danielle as my witness and Julian's CFO, a dry and brilliant man named Harold Marsh, as his. We went to dinner afterward at a restaurant that didn't require a reservation, because Julian, it turned out, had a quiet arrangement with the maitre d' of most of the restaurants in a 12-block radius. I wore a navy dress and flat shoes, and I ate pasta, and at some point in the evening I laughed at something he said, something dry and unexpected, and I saw his expression change in a way I hadn't seen before, something loosening, some held tension releasing, like a man who had been slightly uncertain and was now not. What? I said. Nothing, he said. Tell me. He looked at me across a small restaurant table with the same steadiness he'd looked at me across a wine-soaked marble floor. I've been waiting to hear that, he said, the laugh. I wasn't sure I'd gotten it right. I looked at him. Gotten what right? The dress, the restaurant, all of it. He paused. You're harder to read than most people. It's one of the things He stopped. Julian Thorne, CEO of a $13 billion corporation, stopped mid-sentence and looked briefly, genuinely uncertain in a way that made something in my chest ache with fondness. I wanted tonight to be right, he said finally. For you. I thought about the man who had researched me from a car accident report, who had built a trap for a test I never knew I was failing, who had knelt on marble in an $11,000 suit and said, "Don't fall apart, not when you're about to win." I thought about all the ways you can be seen, and all the ways you can be invisible, and the enormous disorienting difference between the two. It's right, I said. I still work at St. Augustine. This surprises people. They ask why, and I tell them, because I am good at it, because it matters, because the work does not care who you went home to last night, or what your bank account looks like, or whether your dress got ruined at your own wedding. The work is just the work. A body in crisis needs what it needs. I work trauma. I take doubles when they need me. I come home sometimes at 3 in the morning and Julian is awake, reading, and he hands me tea without asking how it went because he knows I'll tell him if I want to, and I need a minute first. He has learned my silences the way a good doctor learns a patient's history, not to fill them, but to understand them. Margaret Vance sent me a letter 6 months after the settlement. I didn't open it. I gave it to Rachel Kim, who said it contained something that could charitably be described as an apology, and less charitably described as a legal strategy. I told Rachel to do whatever she thought was right. I never thought about the letter again. Ryan I heard about once more, through a mutual acquaintance, briefly. He had gotten engaged again, to a woman from Connecticut, who apparently came from a reasonably established family. The acquaintance told me this with the expectant look of someone waiting for a reaction. I considered what I felt. I hope she has good attorneys, I said. That was the last time I discussed Ryan Vance.